Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sabina Bakenra, and I'm a science associate with UCSF's program on reproductive health and the environment, where I run the Science Action Network. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Science and Democracy Under Siege, which is part one of our webinar series titled Science in the Crosshairs, Understanding and Addressing the Challenges in a Shifting Political Landscape. This series is hosted in collaboration with the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Collaborative for Health and the Environment. So please check out both of these amazing organizations. In today's symposium, scientists from the Union of Concerned Scientists will discuss findings from their recent report, Science and Democracy Under Siege, discussing and documenting how censorship and suppression of scientific information and the rolling back of important environmental protections have undermined scientific integrity and threatened the foundations of a healthy and equitable society. The webinar will conclude with a Q&A, so please use the Q&A function to leave any questions you might have. Before we dive into today's discussion, I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes. As I mentioned, symposium is hosted by the Science Action Network, and we encourage you to join. You can use the QR code on the screen, or I'll provide a link in the chat in a second where you can join the network. And this is a network of over 200 scientific experts, public health advocates, and healthcare professionals who use their collective expertise to engage in policy that advances public health and environmental health through public commenting, publications, and more. And we regularly host events such as these where you're able to learn and engage with more about chemical policy at EPA and beyond. Okay, so we're privileged to have with us a group of experts who will guide us through the report. Joining us today is Dr. Kristie Ellickson. Dr. Ellickson is a senior scientist with the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Her research focuses on the integration of elements of cumulative risk and impacts into regulatory analyses and decision making. In her role, Dr. Ellickson builds on past cumulative impacts work from her experience as a state scientist in Minnesota. Joining Dr. Ellickson is Darya Minovi. Darya is a senior analyst for the for Science and Democracy. In her role, she researches the impact of weak environmental and public health protections on communities to support environmental justice and science-based policy making. And our moderator for today is Dr. Rashmi Joglekar. Rashmi leads the science and policy engagement team at PRE. She comes with a wealth of knowledge and understanding of how toxic chemicals impact susceptible populations and communities, and is skilled in addressing those issues with decision makers in Washington, D.C. Rashmi completed her PhD at the Integrated Toxicology and Environmental Health Program at Duke University. So with that, we're actually going to begin the webinar with a Mentimeter poll. So you can just use the code at the top of the screen and enter that at menti.com and type in a response to this question. We'll give people a few minutes to provide their responses before I pass it over to Darya and Kristie to get us started. And for those of you who are unable to work Mentimeter, feel free to type a response into the Q&A and we can also address it there as well. So what do you wish everyone knew about the Trump administration's actions? All right, great. Thank you for your responses. I'll keep this Mentimeter poll open throughout the webinar today. So if you have any further responses, you can put them in there and we can revisit this during our Q&A session. With that, I'll hand it over to Darya and Kristie to get started on their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having us. Just give me one moment. I get my screen shared. All right, can everyone see that? Wonderful. Thank you. So, as Abena introduced us, again, I'm Darya Minovi. I'm a senior analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists, joined here by my colleague Kristie, and we'll be presenting on a report that we recently published for the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And this is Science and Democracy Under Siege, documenting, pardon the typo, 6 months of the Trump administration's destructive actions. To kind of set the stage for this report that we published back in July, UCS has been tracking attacks on science really since its inception, but more specifically since President Trump's first term, when we started to really understand what systematic attacks on science can look like. We did build a database during the first Trump administration that started to track, individual attacks on science as we've defined them. And we are in the process of developing a new tool, but this tool is online if anyone wants to look at it. And in our report, we are building on these efforts and actually updated our methodology. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Kristie, but we have some papers and stuff we can share in the chat of how we defined them previously. And then this time around, really acknowledging that this administration is different and more, unfortunately, strategic and smart about how they are dismantling our federal scientific infrastructure. We did update our methodology to be a bit more inclusive, and there's an amazing, model that Kristie and colleagues are working on to help document these, and that will be available in a new database that will be published in the coming months. So keep an eye out for that. But this report documents and synthesizes these attacks on science and our democracy between January 20th and June 30th of this year. So really trying to capture nearly the first 6 months of the administration. To provide a brief overview of our report, we focused on 5 key areas of attacks on science. These are not all of the attacks we will see or have seen, but the best ways we could kind of wrap our arms around something that at the very beginning was very, and it continues to be, but was very chaotic and just really touching so many aspects of our federal scientific systems. So first, we focused on gutting scientific expertise. This is really focusing on the layoffs and firings at federal agencies, particularly scientific agencies. We also looked at halting science and innovation. This really focused on the loss of grant funding at the NIH and how that might impact our biomedical research funding and systems. Ignoring public input. Again, this is happening in a lot of ways, but our research in this section focused on specific Clean Air Act regulation exemptions that are kind of bypassing immense rulemaking processes that happened under President Biden that are kind of being swept aside to give polluters a pass. Cutting out independent experts. This focuses on terminations and delays in science federal advisory committees. Censoring and suppressing scientific information, which is focused on removal and alteration of information on federal web pages. And finally, we also include a case study that it really brings all these concepts together on how this is impacting climate science and policies at different federal agencies. With that, I'll pass it over to Kristie.
Sure, I'll start talking through some of the results we saw in this report. Our first major finding is the extreme rise in attacks on science in the first 6 months of of President Trump's second term. Compared to 207 in his first term, we have identified 402 in only the first 6 months of his second term. So I'm going to stop there and just say a little bit more about context about how we're doing this. We have evolved our methodology to identify attacks on science in this term. We're looking at attacks on science more inclusively and requiring explicit definitions of types and topics, as well as training ourselves to code these definitions consistently. That said, we are still seeing an unprecedented scale of attacks on science, scientists, and scientific institutions from this administration. As of September 30th, the number of attacks climbed to 506. Next slide, please. So, so the next thing we're going to talk about a little bit is President Trump issued an executive order in May of this calendar year outlining what his administration deems gold standard science. Many of the aspects of that executive order are the typical tenets of the scientific process, such as peer review and reproducibility, but missing is independence. The word independent is not in the executive order, so kind of putting aside independent science, and also within that executive order, they rolled back scientific integrity policies that had seen some improvements in recent years. Scientific integrity policies outline how science in federal agencies can remain unpoliticized. Furthermore, the order calls for transparency in science data, scientific studies, and that is a goal, of course, but it can and was attempted to be weaponized in the first Trump administration. So if you think about requiring only data and studies that can be fully publicly transparent, you eliminate studies that have data that are protected by confidential business information, so chemical reviews, and you eliminate the ability to use studies and data for that use private health information. So epidemiological studies are eliminated. So there's a lot of caution in this executive order, and we need to watch what happens as a result of it. And words and intention are really important, and especially important in this policy. Next slide. So we also looked at the loss of federal workers. Our analysis found, a loss of over 120,000 federal workers. And this was a little challenging, I think, for everyone to follow. It's a dynamic situation since court cases have brought some folks back. Some folks are put on temporary administrative leave and some choose early retirement. And we didn't have data related to who are the scientists that are having their positions eliminated. So we chose to look at federal agencies that employ a significant number of scientists, because that's our purview. So anyway, as we all have heard, and as I just said, in the first 6 months of the Trump administration, over 120,000 federal employees were eliminated, which is nearly 7 times the number eliminated in the same time period the year prior. And we used the data from the New York Times and the Office of Personnel Management. But again, as you can imagine, and as we're all reading about, this is a challenging thing to follow because some folks have been called back. And also, there have been more eliminations of staff at the EPA, and the Health and Human Services Agency has lost additional senior leadership very recently. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you. So we also evaluated the loss of new grants awarded by the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. This agency that used to be referred to as the world's premier funder of biomedical research has awarded 54% fewer new project grants in the first 6 months of 2025 compared to the previous 9-year average, even compared to President Trump's first term. So we are seeing a massive decline in funding for things like toxic exposure, cancer, uh, other health and disease concerns that are no longer receiving funding. And we've heard from many scientists who have been impacted by these grant cuts, not just at NIH, but across federal agencies. Similar to what Kristie shared on the staffing, there has been a lot of litigation around this, including an unfortunate Supreme Court ruling in August that enabled the administration to move forward with these grant terminations. But it continues to be an evolving situation.
So, another theme we investigated is the way in which this administration is bypassing public processes and ignoring the American people in decision making. This is happening in a lot of different ways. So, some of you may have seen in March, the EPA offered 532, around that number, of facilities to bypass their responsibilities under the Clean Air Act for at least 2 years. And that process that was set up is a simple email to ask for an exemption. And that means that these power plants and industrial facilities that now could be exempted from these Clean Air Act responsibilities, they emit, there's a wide variety of them, but many of them emit toxic chemicals such as ethylene oxide and mercury. And we looked at the areas around these facilities to look at a little bit of the demographics around them and which of the facilities were around schools, et cetera, and schools and daycares. Anyhow, this is really problematic because many of the rules that were exempted already had a public process as a part of their development, and so that's being ignored. And this a process in and of itself, writing a simple email to request an exemption, bypasses any kind of public comment period or process. Some of these facilities have already received exemptions, and many of these facilities have received blanket exemptions through executive order. Next slide.
I want to also briefly add that Kristie and I are working on an additional story map analysis of these exemptions. So if stay tuned, follow UCS if you would like to see what we find. Just as a follow-on to what Kristie just shared and on the topic of ignoring public input, I do want to do a quick sidebar to another report that we published in September that kind of dives further into this question of bypassing public processes. Some of you may be aware in February, I mean, the number of executive orders continues to pile up, and there are a number of deregulatory orders, but one that particularly caught our eyes was an executive order that was followed by a memo that you can see quoted here that directed federal agencies to, roll back so-called unlawful regulations using this very rarely used exception in the Administrative Procedure Act, which sort of governs how we do rulemaking. And it's called a good cause exemption. Basically, if a rule is if public processes like notice and comment are deemed impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to public interest, you don't have to do, have a draft where there's comments. This is in litigation, the courts have typically only awarded or sort of deemed use of this exception correct or allowed in emergency situations, which we can all probably say with confidence this is not. But we undertook an analysis to see how often is this exception being used in decision making and rulemaking. So we conducted an analysis. I spent a lot of time in the Federal Register looking at rules published between January 20th and July 31st of this year, focusing on rules issued by these six science agencies. That's Department of Energy, Interior, Transportation, EPA, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Agriculture. And we focused on four types of actions. For those who aren't super familiar with rulemaking, there's, just issuing final rules where there is no draft rule or notice where people can provide comments. There's also these two types of rules called direct final and interim final, which are essentially the same thing, just one is effective now and one is effective later, but essentially it's a final rule where retroactive comments may be accepted and may be considered and could lead to an actual draft rule, but may not happen. And then there's also just delaying final rules that were finalized under President Biden. So just delaying the effective date of those so that they're never actually effective. Briefly, these are our findings from that report. You can see the Department of Transportation, by and large, is bypassing public comment. We found that about out of 600 final rules that were issued by these six agencies, about a third of them bypass notice and comment. Again, these are the instances where that's happening in those agencies. I won't give you all of the findings, but we can provide a link to the report if you want to read more about how often this is happening. All right, back to our other report that we started with. So our fourth area of analysis was disruptions and interferences with federal advisory committees. For those who might not be aware, federal advisory committees are a very important way in which independent experts can help inform agency decision making and sort of provide a level of accountability and oversight over the decision making at the agency. There was an executive order pretty early on that directed agencies to eliminate about a third of their federal advisory committees. And then we've been seeing a number of actions to eliminate members of advisory committees, get rid of them altogether, delay their meetings. So using the Federal Advisory Committee database, we evaluated disruptions at more than 200 science and technical advisory committees, which is a specific subset of them. Some are policy focused, and we focused on the science advisory committees. We found that 27% of active science advisory committees had been terminated in the first 6 months, and the agencies that were most impacted by these disruptions were USDA, HHS, EPA, and the National Science Foundation. Some examples you might have seen in the news are, the EPA's Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, which does a lot of work on like particulate matter standards, as well as CDC's Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, which provides recommendations around vaccine schedules, for example. I'll talk more about this, but UCS is doing some engagement around advisory committees that we would love to hear your input on as well. Our fifth focus area was on censorship and suppression of scientific information. For this, we worked with the great folks at the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative who were tracking changes to federal environmental and climate web pages. So the data showed that the Trump administration had made almost 180 substantive changes to federal environmental web pages for EPA, NOAA, and other agencies. That can be things like removing, the term climate or environmental justice, words that were deemed unacceptable or, boogeyman words that the administration had identified. More than 2/3 of these changes included removing information altogether or taking web pages down. And most of these changes were related to climate change and environmental justice. UCS recently actually joined a lawsuit that was led by a public citizen, which is suing EPA, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and other federal agencies for removing these critical data tools like EJ Screen and the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, among others. And that litigation is ongoing. Finally, as I mentioned at the top, we had a case study in the report as well. This is kind of a funny table because it's pretty much nearly completely filled out, but identifying the impacts on climate and clean energy policies. You can see that EPA, NOAA, Department of Energy, Interior, and FEMA have specifically targeted and eliminated climate and clean energy programs, funding, staffing, and information. So you can kind of see how these cross-cutting attacks on science are really impacting climate policy and information. And we've also joined separate litigation related to the endangerment finding, which you can find more information about on our website. Pass it back to Kristie.
Great. So we have synthesized all this information and looked at a lot of different analyses under a variety of themes, and we have recommendations for lawmakers and decision makers, which means, all of us talking to our elected officials about these things. We strongly recommend that lawmakers and decision makers support and move forward the Scientific Integrity Act. The Scientific Integrity Act is a bipartisan bill that would require federal agencies to create and implement policies that protect scientific research from political interference. We also recommend that lawmakers and decision makers support and move forward the Expert Act, which used to be Corporate Capture Act, and support and move forward the Whistleblower Protection Act. Furthermore, we recommend that federal advisory committees are rebuilt and modernized. A lot of federal advisory committees have been dismantled by this administration, and they provide independent outside advice to the federal government for decision making. It's kind of a long game way of interacting and participating as the public in government decision making. So we recommend those are rebuilt and modernized. Next, yep. So and we all need to challenge and pay attention to these efforts, these policies, these rule rescissions, these enacted rules that are omitting public participation, both when they don't allow public comments or when they ignore the existing public record. They're not listening to the American public in that instance. And so we need to pay attention and call that out. Also, we are obviously Union of Concerned Scientists and is an organization that advocates for science-based policies that are informed by the best available science. So we advocate and recommend that elected officials hold that up and listen to and push forward science-informed policies. We also recommend that elected officials protect and prioritize funding for federal science, including scientific positions in the federal government. And finally, so much data have been removed from government websites, and that was publicly funded data. We strongly recommend that these data sets are restored, that they remain, or that they are made accessible to all of us. And because they're important, we all need them and we all use them. Next slide.
Thanks, Kristie. I also wanted to just briefly flag the image on the slide, which is from our Science Defense Fly-In, which UCS co-organized with Earth Justice. And you might notice Tracy Woodruff from PRE in the image, who joined us in our meetings where we were advocating for the Scientific Integrity Act and sharing the findings of our report back in July. Some additional resources that are relevant. I'm so sorry for how terrible this slide looks. We will share these URLs in the chat with you all. But first is that we have compiled a number of resources for federal scientists, sort of to protect them and their work from political interference, that you can find on our website. When we published our Access Denied report, which is another resource we recommend you look at, we also published new guidance, fair access guidance for meaningful public participation in government decision-making. This is a very extensive set of best practices that synthesizes both government guidance from particularly the Biden administration that really took this up, as well as environmental justice leaders and peer-reviewed science on how government agencies can effectively engage the public. Notice and comment is the literal bare minimum that's required by law, and there is so much more that federal as well as state agencies can be doing to engage the public and ensure that not just advocacy organizations like ourselves, but impacted communities can have an influence in those decisions, not just corporate actors. And then finally, with respect to advisory committees, as I was mentioning, we also published a how-to guide for running an independent science advisory committee. This fall, UCS is planning to launch a new website with resources including this guide that is on the slide, as well as FAQs, best practices, and template materials that can help support the implementation of an external to government scientific advisory committee. It's also going to feature examples of successful independent committees led by scientists, institutions, and others. If you have examples to share or want to learn more, reach out to me. We'll put our emails in the chat, but we are considering, convening some of these independent committees. So please let me know if that's of interest to you. Finally, there are ways that you can take action. First is urging Congress to pass the Scientific Integrity Act, like Kristie was just talking about. We have an action on our website where you can just put your information in and we'll send a note to your elected official asking them to support this federal legislation. Second is that UCS operates a Science for Public Good Fund. We make small grants of $1,500 for scientists that are undertaking online advocacy, digital community building, or other efforts to advance equitable science-based policy. Those applications are due by January 6th and are live now, so we can put a link if you want to apply or share with scientists in your network. And because there cannot only be one science network, UCS also has a science network that we operate. It has over 20,000 scientists from across the country, as well as engineers, public health researchers who work together to engage in advocacy. We put on webinars, trainings on science policy. So if you would like to be in more than one science-related network, we encourage you to join us as well. Thank you. There are emails on the slide if you want to get in touch, and we can also put them in the chat.
Thank you so, so much, Darya and Kristie. That was an incredible presentation, very illuminating, very incredible and disturbing findings. I have a lot of mixed emotions, I'm sure our attendees do as well. I want to invite folks I see that there are some questions that are coming up in the Q&A. And so I'm gonna walk through those, but I did want to open up with one and kind of pulling at some of the comments that were shared at the beginning of the call. One comment that was shared is that these actions will take generations to recover from. This really struck me because it's true. And I'm curious, in both of your opinions, how long do you think these changes are going to take to reverse this kind of systematic scientific erasure? And what steps do you think need to be taken by the public, by scientists, by public health and policy professionals to kind of move the needle forward faster?
I can go first in answering that question. I do not know how long it will take, but I kind of keep thinking about the fact that we need to keep doing work that progresses the work that was, kind of making progress. We need to do work that is more defensive, calling out and naming the impacts and linking some of these sometimes procedural situations with the impacts that people are going to feel in communities, as well as designing how we're going to rebuild, and all while keeping an eye on where did we want to go? What protections do we need, and do we hear communities needing? And so it's a lot of work there that I just named. And so what I'm going to finish by saying is that we need to all keep our energy up doing this work and take care of ourselves. So it's kind of a long answer, not one I would usually give. So thanks for the question.
That's beautiful, Kristie. I would just add, yeah, I think we talk a lot about in UCS how it's not just a light switch. It's much easier to dismantle than to rebuild, and it's going to take a long time. But like Kristie said, trying to call out the impacts as much as possible in people's communities. I write a lot about HHS and just talking about how the Make America Healthy Again movement is so disconnected from what's actually happening, talking about toxics in our food while eliminating regulations that would decrease our exposure to toxic chemicals is insane to me. And I try to talk about those connections in a way that's obviously not demonizing the movement as much as I can, or at least the people who support the movement, not those who are in the administration. And I think for me, one thing, I live in DC, and just being able to engage in local efforts, whether it's joining grassroots organizations, EJ organizing in my community, or the Free DC movement, supporting mutual aid, which is, I know, a small thing, but when these issues feel so huge, I find that going local is one of the best ways to fight back.
Thank you both. Those are excellent responses. I'm going to pull in a question from the chat. Are your efforts focused more on congressional engagement or executive branch engagement? What do you think is most effective, and who are the natural allies?
We do have a policy team that is leading all of that congressional engagement and is constantly in contact with members of Congress around the Scientific Integrity Act and other efforts that we are either asking them to engage on. Representative or Tonko, sorry, I'm not a policy person, but he's been a super champion for the Scientific Integrity Act, and if you're interested in knowing who all those champions are, I can send you a follow-up email with that list from our policy team. We do engage with the executive branch, or we at least try to. We send letters. We do reach out to folks who are in those offices, not always getting responses from them, but we try. But I think right now in this climate, probably Congress is the most effective way to engage.
I guess I can add from my own perspective, the field that I mostly work in is cumulative impacts, which is kind of a solution based field to provide environmental protections that are more holistic, looking at the different ways we're exposed to chemicals and social adversity that surrounds us from the systems and structures that are around all of us. And the work right now, the way to engage is locally and within states. There are over 7 states who have passed cumulative impacts laws. There are a couple cities, including Washington, D.C. and Chicago, working on ordinances and laws. And that is my opinion in moving that work forward, that is the best way to engage right now. And I'm happy to, if you contact me, I'm happy to help you find a way to do that.
That's great. And actually, you kind of answered my next question, which was around the deepening of health inequities. And you presented this really striking data of over 500 facilities across the US that have applied for these exemptions and received exemptions for Clean Air Act regulation. And compounding that is this problem of the NIH, and you also alluded to this, not allowing new grants or existing grants to contain terminology like climate change or environmental justice. And that's, again, not only contributing to scientific erasure, but also deepening health inequity because we're going to have less evidence in the literature supporting these inequities. And Kristie, you talked about ways that the scientific community or really the public can get involved from the policy front. I'm curious about your opinion on the scientific side of things. So, do we need more science in this area? And if people want to continue conducting this type of work, what are your recommendations?
I'm thinking of a couple. That's a big question and a really good question. A lot of times, I guess I can respond to that from a cumulative impacts perspective. A lot of times there already is the data, there's already the evidence, and we need to act. And, there is already enough evidence that pollution needs to be reduced in many, many communities around the country. And so that is my first and foremost response. The type of science to engage in. I think, I guess I'm going to respond again from the cumulative impact space. The big place that's really important to think about right now is how to pull in and include lived experience, community experts, what they know about their community, what they know about exposures and health conditions, and integrating that together with ways of doing quantitative measurements and modeling and monitoring of communities is super important, and that can grow. That area can and should grow to combine those two types of expertise. So I suppose that's the way I'm going to answer that question. It's a really good question, but yeah, I will just keep it there. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. So lots of questions coming in the Q&A. I'm going to start with Maria's question. Any thoughts of creating a Western states EPA like the new vaccine coalition?
That's a tough one. I mean, I I worry about further fracturing our nation if we start to, develop independent agencies in certain regions. I mean, in theory, with cooperative federalism, there should be, collaboration at different levels of government. So, I don't know, actually. I guess my answer is I'm not sure, and maybe there's political scientists or Kristie, you worked in state government. You might have more thoughts on that.
I mean, here's my response. So again, sorry to continue to come from the cumulative impact space. There are laws in more than 7 states. There are cities that are writing ordinances, but that isn't a broad federal protection where everyone is protected under those more holistic and environmental protections. So I mean that's the goal is to have the whole country be equally protected under these types of policies. Um, I guess in the meantime, what I have been talking about a lot is the need for I don't want to fracture our policy making, but the need for formal structures outside of the federal government. So some of these states and cities that are developing environmental protections and moving and trying to protect the people that live in their communities better, to have ways for them to talk to each other, kind of in a formal structure, which used to be the EPA, and now can maybe be overseen in academia or with foundations, et cetera. When you're writing rules to kind of push forward environmental protections, you need to be able to say the words out loud. So you might be able to think about what are those possible impacts, or how are the different ways the words, in an environmental rule or policy will be understood, and that type of thing. So yeah, in the meantime, we're going to need formal structures so that people can still coordinate and collaborate. And that is happening. That is definitely happening.
That's great. There's a question about state preemption, that, this is potentially becoming more of a problem. Do you have suggestions on how to navigate the increased threats to progress because of state preemption?
Yes, I was just talking about that earlier with the proposed TSCA rule that would essentially preempt states from banning or restricting certain chemicals from use. I mean, there are ways to battle preemption through, for example, this is a rule that in theory, thankfully, there is actually a rulemaking process here. So commenting on regulations where that is proposed is a fantastic way. Even if you don't anticipate that the agency is going to do something about it, having comments in the public record is still supported when there's, for example, litigation that might be brought. There's a lot of litigation that happens around preemption. So I always, even when I'm dealing with an unfriendly administration, I think it's always so important to just have your voice heard in the record, because litigation is one of the best ways we can fight against this at this moment. And of course, if the state level is preempted from taking action, then there's always opportunity to work within your local government systems, whether through health department. So, thinking smaller or more local at the state level. But I think, yeah, doing what we can to oppose legislation that's introduced in our states that would preempt local health departments from taking action, for example, and the same from the federal to the state level, um, commenting as much as we can.
Yes, I agree with all of that. Um, there are two more questions in the chat that I want to elevate. One of them is about the national academies. So the question is, has the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine been doing anything that you think has been effective? And if not, what would you like to see them doing? And this is a question from Dr. Stan Glantz, who's part of the National Academy of Medicine, and who has been involved in pressuring leadership to get more engaged.
I can answer again from the cumulative impact space. Just last week, they published their State of the Science on Cumulative Impacts. I saw on a post from the former head of Office of Research and Development, Chris Frey, formerly from the EPA, saying that is the way science should be done. I think I'm totally paraphrasing what he said. But yes, that was a good piece of work, important for us all to read and take in. I was appreciative that they called the environmental justice mapping and cumulative impacts mapping kind of the state of that effort mature. That was helpful. And so yeah, that's what I would lift up in that response.
I guess I would also add, yes, that there's a lot of, I've been heartened to see that the academies are still posting research and, having convenings that don't appear to be as influenced by the, administration's actions as we're seeing in other spaces. I also think it's such an important place where we can still see independent science happen. I know, for example, the independent report on formaldehyde, as well as the review of Texas's ethylene oxide cancer risk value, were incredibly important for helping to, again, uphold best available science, particularly when we're not seeing that happen right now within the EPA, having those reputable and respected bodies still carrying out those processes I know there's been some attacks on the national academies, but as long as they can continue to do their work, and we can point to that again, so helpful for litigation, again, if we have like, technical information like this that we can point to as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was just gonna to elevate that last point myself is that, any evidence coming out of the national academies, really constitutes best available science, and it is such a great point of leverage for litigation teams to use to hold agencies accountable. So I would definitely underscore all those comments to keep doing the excellent work. There is one final question about trying to generate new data because of all the information that's kind of being censored or pulled down from government websites. Um, you know, what can people do to generate new data, I think is the question. I'm also curious if you both could maybe share a couple of maybe teasers to your report on how to kind of organize not federal, but scientific advisory committees. So I guess combining both of those, what can people do to kind of generate new data, make it publicly accessible in the face of this scientific erasure? And then how can scientists organize to provide the scientific input on decision making that's not really being done very well at the federal level at this point?
On the data, there are so many folks out there who are working to archive government data that is no longer being collected or no longer has a place to live online. When I stop speaking, I will try to put a bunch of those in the chat. And there's some places like the Wayback Machine where you can yourself help archive government data. So that's one way is just kind of I don't actually know if we need new websites. There's so many people out there who are archiving this information. Sorry, what was the second question?
The second question was if you could give teasers about your work
Oh,
on the organized scientist organizing to form advisory committees.
yes. So I'm not sure, do we put the toolkit in the chat? Yes, okay,
We
yeah. I would
did.
recommend checking out that toolkit. During Trump 1, UCS helped convene a shadow CASAC or Clean Air Act, Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. And they developed their own independent particulate matter recommendations. And so doing the work that these committees should be doing outside of the scope of government. So we were trying to help move forward that work. And even though we don't expect this administration to take up recommendations that an advisory committee might, produce, state governments might be more receptive to that information, or it might inform their processes. Because obviously states also, rely on these advisory committees and the research they produce. So we might there we're still figuring out what we're doing. There actually may be an opportunity where we may undertake our own shadow advisory committee that we host at UCS, but we're also trying to support other organizations that are interested in hosting shadow advisory committees. Or if people are involved, interested in those, or want to highlight other efforts that are happening, we just want to know and we want to uplift that as much as possible. So please reach out to me. If you are interested, if you have questions, if you have ideas for federal advisory committees that have been sidelined that you want to see their work continue. And then we'll share more in the coming weeks of what we actually have planned.
And I'll add to that, there's always been community science and regular folks train in and get to host an air sensor or look at a bird inventory or have a heat monitor in their backyard so we can look at extreme heat in urban areas. And, because that can really change block to block in a city. And being involved in that type of thing builds data and is kind of a fun way to engage in doing science. At the same time, there are some states and cities that are publishing policies that outlaw the use of community science in decision making or outlaw the use of just considering community science. And so we should speak, in my opinion, we should speak out against those policies and laws and lift them up because we need that information. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you both, and thank you so much to everyone. I think this was a really rich discussion. I so appreciate both of you and the time and effort that UCS has put into uncovering truly and quantifying the attacks on science in this very strange climate that we're all in. I think that last question maybe is a good segue into Abina's going to wrap this up and preview some of our upcoming webinars. One of them will be focused on federal scientific advisory committees, hopefully to provide a little bit of guidance to scientists who may serve on those committees, kind of about their structure and function and the legal landscape behind them and what folks can do and how they can become engaged and perhaps even form their own. So, Bina, I'll turn it to you. And again, Darya and Kristie, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Again, thank you so much. I think this was a really invaluable conversation that we had. And thank you, Rashmi, for being the moderator. I think you did a really great job. So, as Rashmi mentioned, I just have a few quick announcements. So, part one was the first part of this series. In November on the 5th, we'll have part two, which will explore how EPA is not using the best available science in recent TSCA rulemakings and how these failures threaten to further erode already insufficient practices in safeguarding the public from toxic chemical exposures. In part three on December 11th, as Rashmi mentioned, we'll learn about the influence of financial conflicts of interest on science and regulatory decision making, the laws that minimize harm, and current efforts by the Trump administration to enable corporate capture of the EPA and dismantle environmental regulation altogether through this sort of lens of regulatory science and federal advisory committees. And I'm also putting in the chat the links to register for part two and part three. So we hope to see you there and that you can join us. Moving to some other announcements. there are a lot of opportunities to get involved at the work that we do at the program on reproductive health, one of which is to guest blog and spread your science. Especially now, I think there's so much important work that's going on in many ways that we can work collectively. So if this is something that you're interested in doing, you can contact our comms director, Susan, and I'll put her email in the chat as well. Sorry, do that. I'll do that in 1 second. And then lastly, for more information about the work that we do at PRE, you can scan our QR code or visit our website. And then finally, again, just to plug our Science Action Network, this is a great way to get involved and to learn about opportunities like this. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we hopefully will see you at our next few webinars in this series. And thank you again, Daria and Kristie. I think this was really insightful, and I hope everyone takes a moment of their day to read your report and follow for your future reports.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
everyone.
Thanks.